Today we're going to talk about the digestive system, and this PowerPoint serves as your general overview of the chapter, summarized into kind of one quick PowerPoint for you. The functions of the digestive system are first and foremost for ingestion, physically bringing in that food into the body. Mechanical breakdown, which is breaking down that food into smaller pieces. Digestion, which is the chemical breakdown of food. Secretion, which comes in the form of fluids and enzymes. Absorption, this is the opposite of secretion, so we're absorbing nutrients directly into the bloodstream. And then excretion, which is the release of waste. The digestive system is also called the alimentary canal or the GI tract. And this starts from the mouth, going towards the back of the mouth into the pharynx, down the esophagus, into the stomach, then into the small intestines, into the large intestine, which is mostly the colon, and then from the rectum through the anus. So we're going to dive into the very first part of the digestive system, which is the oral cavity or your mouth. Inside of the oral cavity, there are 3 pairs of salivary glands, and what they're going to do is they're obviously going to release a mixture of saliva, which is a mixture of water and enzymes. It's about 99.4% water, but it also has enzymes to start that beginning process of breaking down food particles. And the 2 enzymes that it releases are amylase, which starts to break down larger carbohydrates, and lysozyme, which helps keeps bacteria at healthy levels inside of your mouth. And without lysozyme, that bacteria would get out of control, even with using mouthwash. Other features of your oral cavity are the tongue, which is a very strong muscle, which helps obviously in digestion and moving that food back into the oral cavity. Your teeth, which we're going to dive a little more into in the next slide. And then the hard and soft palate, as we learned in the last chapter, the hard palate would be towards the front of the mouth, so the roof of your mouth, and the soft palate would be posterior. So diving into teeth, talking about the shiny pearly whites, you'll have noticed back in our skeletal system, we actually didn't talk about teeth and learn all about them. And this is because teeth fit more appropriately with the beginning of your digestive system. While teeth do contain nerves and blood vessels, as you'll see in the pulp layer here, to feed that tooth with nutrients, they are very different to the bones of the skeletal system that we looked at in lab. Do you recall observing how our long bones contain a plethora of cells? When we looked under the microscope, we observed those concentric circles. They were a whole bunch of rings with black dots. And we discussed how those dots are what contain the osteocytes or bone cells. So if you broke your arm, the bone itself would be able to heal. Your teeth don't have that kind of regenerative power. Human teeth have very low to almost complete absent regeneration. And this is because of early loss of the cell populations that have that type of capacity, namely the stem cells. Superficial to the dentin is the enamel, so that's this white part. The enamel is actually the protective layer that protects all of these softer tissues that are beneath it. So it's the hardest surface actually in your body, and its job is to prevent the wearing away of tissues beneath. And as a human, looking at our teeth, we could say that we're predominantly meant to be an omnivore. You have both broad, flat teeth towards the back, which are made for plant-based materials. And we also have some sharper teeth in the front, which are for ripping through meat. Now, obviously, we don't kill live prey, so we're not going to have the same type of incisors that a straight carnivore would have. But we don't have broad, flat teeth like a lot of herbivores in the front either. So we do have a little bit of combination of both. On average, adults have about 32 teeth, but not everyone has those, and that could be from a couple of factors. It could be genetics, so something in utero that you were predispositioned to have less than 32 teeth based on your genes, or possibly you had them removed when you had to make space when you went to the dentist. So if anyone's ever heard of impacted teeth, these can cause a lot of pain. And so here I've got an x-ray showing what happens when your teeth are impacted. So sometimes there's just not enough space in the mouth. And so the teeth start to grow in at an angle. And so you can see this one's really bad. It's growing completely sideways. And what happens is those ingrowing wisdom teeth start to push against the other teeth, causing a lot of pain. And then over time, that continued pressure on the teeth would displace the other teeth from where they're meant to be. So this is when they would go in and take out the wisdom teeth. After we leave the oral cavity, we're going to move down into the esophagus. And that is, after you've swallowed, that's where the voluntary control ends. So food is moving down the esophagus, and this motion of moving is called peristalsis. Peristalsis, if we zoom in here, is where the esophagus is actually moving in waves to move that bolus of food down from the oral cavity into the stomach. Moving into the stomach here, there's this little doorway from the esophagus into the stomach, and this is called the esophageal sphincter. And you can think of this as a doorway. It is preventing fluid from going back into the esophagus. However, it's not an extremely strong sphincter. It's not as strong as the pyloric sphincter down here from the stomach to the small intestines. So if you had an upset enough stomach, it can allow food to go back up, and thus when you vomit. And then looking into the stomach itself, you can see all these little lines here in this picture, these 2D lines. These are called rugae. So rugae are meant to increase the surface area of the stomach. And it maximizes the ability for absorption and secretion. Also, since they are all kind of bunched and kind of close together here, as you eat more food, they are able to, it allows for the expansion of your stomach so that as you're eating, your stomach can kind of get a little larger with ease. You also have glands inside the stomach, which you can't see in this cartoon picture of your stomach here. These glands are what's releasing hydrogen and chloride ions. And once they are released from the cells themselves, they become hydrogen chloride in the stomach, which will also create pepsin from the release of other chemicals. And this together is what's going to allow for that breakdown further of your food. There's a little absorption of food that happens in the stomach, but most of that actually happens in the small intestine. Here we kind of see that zoom in of all the small intestine here. So you have three main segments of the small intestine: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And if we were to look at a cross section, which is what I have in this GIF, it would be a cross section of the small intestine. We can see that inside the small intestine, there's villi, or villus for singular, and their function is for absorption. And here you see that small intestine in that GIF is also moving by peristalsis to move the food along as well. And what we're going to do on the next slide is we're actually going to zoom in to one singular villus that we see, one of these tiny little villus in there. We're going to zoom in and take a cross section of that. And this is actually how food is going to be absorbed into the body. All right, so here inside of that single villus, we see the single layer of epithelium. This allows for the diffusion of food straight across those cells. And then inside of this villus, we also have a capillary bed here. And so that food could diffuse straight into the bloodstream to be carried to the areas of the body that is needed. And we also have in peach here what is represented as called the lacteal. This is a tiny part of your lymphatic system. And if you remember, when we talked about your lymph nodes and your lymphatic system, you have a lot of white blood cells that are stored in this region. And so this aids in, as you eat food, if there's any type of excess bacteria that has gotten this far, the lacteal is going to help filter out anything extra that could be damaging to the body. Then leaving the small intestine, we're going to go in towards the large intestine. This is where we're actually going to find the appendix. So at the end of that small intestine, it's called the vermiform appendix. This is actually a vestigial structure. If you remember from biology, when we talked about vestigial structures, these were from our ancestors. And our ancestors, we believe, ate a lot more uncooked meat than we do today. So it's thought that this structure is helpful in the fight of bacteria from undercooked or uncooked meat. When paleontologists look at specimens of human ancestors, they believe that the appendix was actually larger in our predecessors, showing that they actually ate a lot more undercooked meat than we do today. However, if you're somebody who's had like an appendix attack and you had to have your appendix removed, it is recommended that you try to avoid foods such as sushi, because we do still think it does play some kind of a role in helping keep that bacteria at bay. So after leaving the appendix, we now would move into the large intestine. The beginning of the large intestine down here is called the cecum. This is the initial portion of the large intestine. And then the remaining majority is actually your colon. So you have the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and the sigmoid colon. And what these segments do is predominantly of the absorption of water out of the remnants of that food. And then finally, it's the creation of solid waste or feces. Furthermore, when the excretion of feces is not solid, it's typically because some type of bacteria has been inhibiting the absorption of water within the colon. By the time the bolus or food has moved to the sigmoid colon region, this is the portion that's going to function as the storage of the feces itself. The liver is the largest internal organ, has a lot of major functions actually. It does carbon, lipid, and amino acid metabolism. It further assists in waste product removal. The liver also functions as bile production, which becomes excreted to help break down food. It also is part of vitamin storage and the breakdown of drugs. Furthermore, it functions as a phagocytosis of red blood cells. And so we know that red blood cells are produced inside of our bones. When those red blood cells become old or damaged, they are moved to the liver where they are destroyed. It also plays a role in the synthesis of plasma proteins. One's dissolved within the plasma, and these are produced by the liver. And then finally, the removal of hormones when they're no longer needed. For an example, your body produced insulin, and now it no longer needs such a high level of insulin, so the liver is going to break that down. After the liver has produced bile, it is stored inside of the gallbladder, which you can see here, which is directly inferior, kind of tucked in underneath the liver. The gallbladder stores this bile, and it has this what's called the common bile duct, which is shown right here. The common bile duct connects to the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. This bile is going to emulsify fat, which means it's going to break down the lipids inside of the food.